The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.
Hi there. The Georgian startup community is taking the world by storm. With Pulsar AI's phenomenal exit, Georgian founders appeared on the global investment scouting map. After Pulsar AI, many more Georgian companies appeared on the US market, with Theneo, the winner of the Web Summit startup competition, being the prime example. Yet along with the US, Georgian startups are expanding in Asia too. Payzy is growing in Uzbekistan while Kernel is expanding in India. One could argue that over the years, Georgian founders found their niche. It's Fintech, undoubtedly. From Germany founded Raisin to Georgia founded Payzy and Space International, serving millions of customers in Germany, the United States of America and Uzbekistan, founders are looking deeper into the marriage of finance and technologies. Yet many questions about the Georgian startup ecosystem are still left unanswered. Is Fintech the gateway to commercial success? Why is Fintech so attractive in a country where commercial banks are very efficient? What is the government's role in the developing of Georgian startup ecosystem? These are some of the questions I'll ask two leading Georgian experts today. I'm joined by Colin Donohue, co-director at startup Grind Tbilisi, and Levan Shalamberidze, East Asia equity lead at the International Financial Corporation. While startup Grind Tbilisi has brought insights from deeply experienced venture capitalists such as Bill Reichart and Marvin Liao, and played a crucial role in connecting Georgian founders to the international investors, Levan Shalamberidze has managed investments of over $1 billion with the mandate to help startups from developing economies scale. Hi gentlemen, thank you for being here at BMG. I'm very happy to have this interview about the Georgian startup ecosystem, because talking about it and finding the ways to develop this little community is one of the most important things we could do.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Let me begin with a very broad and general questions that I will pose to both of you, because I would like to get to as many perspectives as I could. So let's start with the local overview. Let's start with you, Colin. Could you summarize what is going on in the Georgian startup ecosystem today?
Sure. So I've been here 7 years. And over that time, things have gone from a very, very low baseline where there weren't really internationally competitive startups to where over the last couple of years, more and more startups have started raising multi-million-dollar seed rounds, have been getting customers internationally, and have really positioning themselves to scale. So part of what's happening is there's an awareness of what a high-growth, venture-backable startup is. Because there's so many things you can start that are a start, but when you look at startups, it's more in the terminology of venture capital, right? Venture investors are looking for something that can achieve very high scale, very, very quickly. So they're looking for a certain type of investment. Those investments weren't really on the market now, but Georgian founders are starting to really get a feel for that. And so Georgia's really, like you said, getting on the map.
Yeah, look, Colin's been here for 7 years, but I've been away for more than 20 years from Georgia, and and I've started to look at the Georgian startup ecosystem maybe like 2 years ago when I was working from here during the COVID period, and I have to say I was very pleasantly surprised in terms of the new startups that are starting and developing, and the quality of those founders is something that we can be proud of. I think there is a lot of work to be done, and on the flip side, there is a huge potential, growth potential for these startups, and maybe we can talk about what are the challenges and what needs to be done, but I think it's a great start, and very optimistic about the Georgian startup ecosystem here.
Well, let's continue with challenges, and the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is basically non-existence of venture capital. But then again, given the Georgian context, on one side we don't have venture capital, but on the other side we have GITA, Georgia's Innovation and Technology Agency, which in a way acts like a source of first money for a lot of Georgian startups. Let me ask you this, Colin, based on your experience, how good of a job does GITA do here in Georgia?
I mean, it's a complex question. But what I would say is when you look at countries that are working to develop startup ecosystems, I think the work that GITA has done has been very useful. When you look at the World Bank analysis of the amount of capital raised and exit value and so on and so forth, I mean, you're approaching $100 million. And for an early startup ecosystem where there wasn't much momentum initially, this is a very significant step forward. So I feel like we've gone from where things are sort of at a standstill to where there is some momentum, right? Is it going to go on its own like a freewheel? Not yet. But I do feel like there's been movement towards that. I mean, has everything they've done been perfect? No, that's just not the way life is. But there are certain strategies that have been very effective and that have both gotten startups moving and also improved the quality of the founders' mindset and thinking about startups.
Levan, let me reposition this question to you. In your opinion, how sustainable is the model that GITA has? And in general, how sustainable is when a governmental agency doesn't support finances directly startups? And could you bring maybe some best case examples from the world?
Sure. So, look, I think when we think about the best startup ecosystem in different countries, in my mind, there are three main requirements. One is the education centers that can produce the tech talent. The other one is regulatory environment and maybe cultural aspects in terms of innovation culture of that place, of that country. And the third is the venture capital, the funding side of it, right? So I think on the regulatory side of things and the cultural aspects, I think we're well advanced. Of course, there is always more to do, but the easiness of starting business, the open-mindedness of the national bank that is trying to help startups, and for example, they're doing this, the approach of sandboxes, allowing the new startups to start with baby steps and then putting more regulatory burden on them later on rather than from the beginning. The education is also, there needs to be improvement, but there are some education institutions in Georgia, whether it's Free University or Caucasus University or the Kutaisi International University that is producing some tech talent already. But I think what is really missing is the venture capital funding. I think it's right now non-existent. So that's why the role that GITA is playing is quite important. And I'll bring up the example of Israel, and I might bring it up again a couple more times, is that in Israel, with a vibrant startup ecosystem, initially the government actually took on the role of supporting those startups because the venture capital was not available either. Because it's not just the money aspect of it, it's also the expertise. How do you invest? How do you support? How do you make them grow, right? So the venture capital is not just the money, it's also the skill set. So the government stepped in, they started the grants, they also created the first venture capital fund. So from that context, what GITA is doing is very important. I think there's an idea of also doing some kind of fund that GITA will participate together with the outside capital, the private capital. So I think they're trying their best and they're on the right track. We need more. We need private equity, private venture capital to also step in, but it's a process.
So in this process, what could be GITA's role? I understand that in the beginning, giving the early finance to companies is very good. But now, how I look at it is that we are somehow in the middle position with our top startups. They already are very good. They expanded internationally. But then the new generation of startups, they are not so well adapted as the first generation were, which is basically a natural process. We all understand that. But could, for instance, GITA somehow in later years transform from financing institution to some sort of intermediary institution that will, for instance, talk to Silicon Valley VCs, to talk to Asian VCs, and then somehow bringing them into Georgia? What's your take on that, Colin?
Yeah. So I think one thing that's very important is development. As Levan said, is the functions of a venture fund are not just providing capital, right? So these networking functions, if you have a GP here and a GP sitting in Silicon Valley who's networked with all of the follow-on funding sources, large customers, national media in the US, for example, there are incredible benefits to these networks. By contrast, there is there is a bunch of Georgian capital from individuals and companies going into startups where the investors have no idea really what a startup is. They don't understand the dynamics of success in a startup as it's different than a conventional business. And if you approach a startup as a conventional business, it is not going to succeed at scale, and you're going to have bad outcomes on average. So it's much better to create incentives for those folks. And I know startups that are getting multi-million-dollar investments from Georgian investors, unintermediated, right? The money just goes into the startup, and it's like, good luck, guys. Like, you know, I know a guy in New York who's a banker, and other than that, you're on your own. And at this stage in the development of the ecosystem, that is very, very dangerous because they're probably going to have bad outcomes that were preventable. So if you have incentives where the government says, okay, we're going to screen the qualifications of the GPs, and we're going to match private sector money coming in, you create an incentive for the private sector to put money in, and that then you have some sort of adults in the room, if you will, or, you know, gray hair people, you know, who understand and they've seen the up cycles and the down cycles. Now so many founders are just shocked because it's so hard to raise money. And it's like, yeah, they were raising money in an up cycle, you're not going to be able to do that. So I think having some real experience and gravitas wrapped around the capital is very important. If you're just sticking money on someone's cap table, you're not necessarily doing them a favor in getting into international markets and scaling quickly.
Let me switch to fintech now, because as I mentioned in my introduction, and we can always, all of us can see that some of the most prominent, you know, leading prime examples of Georgian startups are all basically in fintech, you know, and they have been, we've seen this tremendous example of Thomas Georgadze and Raisin and doing incredible business in Germany, now in the United States of America as well. In Kaspi as well, yeah, exactly. I forgot about him. Yeah, that's a very good point. Kaspi. Then we have Payzy, we have Kernel in India. You know, all these incredible minds working on financial technologies. So you know, I've heard this notion during my studies in Europe that the goal of any fintech is to be acquired by a bank. But then when I somehow entered from the outside perspective, when I look at the Georgian startup ecosystem, I see that the trends in Europe and trends in Georgia are very different. And mainly, in my opinion, it's because the Georgian banking sector is very developed. It's developed both from operational side. We saw in 2022 they had over 2 billion lari in profits, and it's incredibly efficient from the customer side, because you can basically do whatever you want from your phone. You know, in this environment, why and how is Georgian fintech industry flourishing? Levan, let me ask you.
Sure. So first of all, let me start by agreeing that the Georgian banking sector is well developed. So I travel and work on many developing countries globally, being part of IFC, which is part of the World Bank Group. So we are aware of the banking sectors in all the large and small markets, and Georgia probably has one of the most developed banking sectors. And the fact that the two banks are listed on London Stock Exchange is already a sign of that, right?
It's amazing.
So now, so that creates both a challenge and also an opportunity for a fintech. I think Georgia itself as a market is small enough for fintechs to just succeed on this market. So my view is that the Georgian fintech should be focusing on regional expansion from the get-go. Create something, use the expertise that has been accumulated in this market, whether it's hiring bankers from the banking sector of Georgia, and then looking at going, whether it's Turkey or Uzbekistan or East Asia. I'm actually a big proponent of moving into Asia. I think Asia is today it's the center for economic growth. More than half of the growth is coming from Asia, and then we are quite close to it actually. So I think we need to look at that, and I'm very happy to see both Kernel and Payzy actually going in that direction. So I think that's the right step. The challenge is there I don't think you can beat the banks because they're too big and quite innovative in Georgia, but you can use that expertise and to your advantage and move and do something else in other markets as well outside of Georgia.
But do you really need to beat the banks here in Georgia? You know, because isn't it better to use banks which are, again, expanding internationally as well together with startups? You know, we see Tbilisi Bank, for instance, launching its neobank Tbilisi Uz in Uzbekistan, you know, and then we saw several Georgian startups also joining this direction, you know. Colin, in your opinion and in your experience, because you know all of these guys and you worked with all of these people, what could be the synergies between Georgian fintechs and traditional banks? banks?
Well, I'd like to pick up on something you're saying there that's a little adjacent to that, which is I think it's very important for startups in Georgia and business people who are thinking about investing in startups, policymakers, that we always think about expanding internationally. So Georgia is a sandbox, you can try things out, but the more you can take on international markets, the more you're able to pull in resources, foreign currency, and other resources into the country. So I think that's an incredibly beneficial trend for the health of the economy and for the benefit of everybody, not just the startup, but Georgian society. The synergies, I do think there could be more synergies. So when you look at Uzbekistan, Tbilisi is strong in the Uzbekistan market, and not just for the startups, but I'm also on the board of the American Chamber of Commerce, right? And we hosted a thing with AmCham from Uzbekistan, and there were a lot of Georgian companies that wanted to go into Uzbekistan. So I think if we can look at how companies from Georgia might work together to make the right connections, find the trusted people to work with, and really navigate these foreign markets, that's really going to increase, I think, the effectiveness. And another good trend is this globalize, right? So if there are Georgians overseas, you can connect with those folks, then you find the right people to work with. So I think one of the synergies is just finding the right people to work with and sharing intelligence about the market.
Let me add an additional question to that. How easy is it, in your opinion, to connect to, so for instance, if you are a guy, a fintech guy, startup guy, for you, how easy is it to find someone abroad, and how efficiently because work, for instance, diaspora works, diaspora questions, how can person easily expand overseas without being somehow exposed to that particular country in the past?
Yeah, I think it's a lot about building your reputation and your relationships. And I always tell founders, reputation, relationships are a lot of what's going to help you with growth. So founders, even before they have a startup idea, should be developing their international networks, doing little things to help other people, doing little projects, like where you build your reputation so that when you need somebody to vouch for you, they know you and they can open the door to the next person. So really, I encourage people, so say you want to find an investor, don't just go right at that investor. Find the people who can open the doors and get you there. So a lot of it is sort of relationships, step by step. There are also commercial things you can do, but really the strongest, I believe, is when you're coming from trusting relationships where you've known people for a little while and they're opening doors for you. I don't know, Levan, if you have a different perspective.
Yeah, look, I'll actually provide a word of caution because we invest globally and we've seen a number of cases of successful expansion to other countries, but we have also seen a lot of failures. And it's quite difficult actually because no country works the same way as other countries. It's always different, whether it's regulations or the culture or relationships, different levels of corruption. So it's not easy. But I think in Georgia we do have this expertise that is better than most of our regional countries in our regions. So there is the ability and capability to transfer some of this knowledge that has been accumulated here to other countries, and it's also a necessity because the Georgia by itself is a small enough market, and the other opportunities in other markets are large. But it has to be done step by step. I agree with you. It's building the relationships of understanding those countries, having a criteria, where to go, why, how to select those countries. It's not easy, but it can be done. So I would encourage them to plan ahead.
And I think also incorporating local leadership. So you look at the example of Kernel, it's like a Georgian company, a small Georgian company, they're fundraising to do something in India. When you talk to investors, they're like, what? This is crazy talk. But they have taken the time to learn the market, so on and so forth, and now they've hired an excellent person who's going to lead the country operations in India. So if you find that trusted person who's respected by a lot of people, that's where everything flows more easily. So really, you need to find the right people who you can bet on to lead in certain markets, either geographic or even sectoral, right? Like if you have different services, you want to find that key individual who's trusted in that sector as well. So yeah, it's a lot about the systems of how people trust each other, I believe.
In recent years, there have been several developments, several major developments, I would say, in the Georgian startup ecosystem. One of them is when 500 startups, or now known as 500 Global, entered the Georgian market. Now yearly they're doing the startup acceleration projects, which is incredible. But another thing that I would like to highlight, that with years passing by, we see more and more international founders participating in 500 Georgia's programs. You know, we see people from Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine as well. You know, so somehow we see the Georgian startup ecosystem, and Georgia itself is somehow transforming into a regional hub for different sorts of technologies. And at the same time, we saw after the war in Ukraine began a huge influx of people, the big part of which are tech people, because they work remotely, they get solid salaries, and then they prefer to work from Georgia. You know, so let me ask you two questions. One is, in your opinion, you know, this influx of people, how good is it, or is it bad for Georgian local talent? Or if we look at it from the other side, will it help to increase competitiveness and the overall level of development in Georgian tech guys?
I definitely think it's a very positive thing that is happening, and I was also slightly surprised that we were all afraid when the war started what effect it would have on the economy of Georgia, but we've seen positive effect, and we've also seen influx of those tech talent that is now based in Georgia and working from here. And this is actually putting Georgia on the map now. So more and more people, international contacts I have, they mention that we understand Georgia is already acting a little bit as a hub. I think the Georgian food and the Georgian climate helps. People want to be based where they can enjoy their lives. But the other aspects are there too. The time zone is also perfect. I'm recently moved to Singapore. As an example, Georgia is right in between London and Singapore, so you can work on both Europe and you can also work on Asia. So that helps. The regulatory environment helps, and the competitiveness will rise. I think people learn from each other. So once we have more people joining and working from here, that's also positive for Georgian entrepreneurs as well.
Colin, are we there yet? Or some things have to be done for Georgia to become not only fintech hub, but in general regional tech hub?
Yeah, I think we're gaining momentum. We're definitely not where we need to be for it to be at critical mass. You know, but as Levan has said, there's a bunch of talent, you know, that has moved in from, you know, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus. The question is, you know, the people who are our allies, right, and who support Georgia, support Georgia's territorial integrity, and respect the country that they're in. I think we do need to embrace particularly those people and integrate them. Also, I see so many other people came during COVID. You know, I was in an elevator in Batumi at the Hilton, and I heard somebody speaking in American accent. I was like, oh, you know, where are you from? Oh, from the US, blah, blah. What are you doing here? It's COVID, I could work from anywhere, so figured why not Batumi? So there's already a lot of movement of people to Georgia just because of the amenity-rich environment. And when you look at hubs, okay, Estonia is great, but in February in Estonia, I'm not going to go hang out there just because it's a nice place to hang out. I'm sorry, no offense. So I think there will be a natural pull of people from around the world as laborers become more flexible, as founders look for the place where they want to grow their company from. San Francisco is very expensive. London's very expensive. All these places, they have a scene, so you want to stay there for the scene. But if we can get a critical mass where there are brilliant people doing global things here, then that can just multiply itself incredibly. And there are some amazing people. Nobody knows they're here. Like you were here. Like Levan, this amazing international investor in VC is under the radar here. But if we can pull people together and showcase that to the world, I think it's a very good opportunity now.
I'll tell you one example. So I'm not going to mention the name, but there is a digital bank, a global one, that is starting operations, and they looked at a number of countries to start their business. They looked at Dubai, they looked at Cyprus, they looked at either Estonia or Lithuania, one of those, and they looked at Tbilisi. They chose Tbilisi. So they're in the process of application within National Bank. You know, if that goes well, this will be another startup choosing to start their business and expand regionally out of Georgia.
Well, that's incredible, and I guess once it's official, we can discuss that with startup founders and you guys as well in more detail. But let me ask you this, and I'll ask you to both of you. So what should be done? What are the necessary steps, and what are the necessary preconditions that have to be in Georgia for it to somehow officially develop into a regional tech hub?
Yeah, I mean, the way that we met is through some discussions about a fintech hub in Georgia, right? And there are certain things like Levan said, I mean, education, venture capital, so on and so forth. I think part of what needs to happen is very specific education that is about emerging trends. What does the future look like? Not what has been taught for the last 30 years, in accounting books or whatever. It's what are the trends? How do you connect with the trends? So really responsive things like intensives for executives, maybe in the banking sector, maybe in startups, to really be ahead of the curve on some things. Boot camps and other non-traditional education things that can get people moving really fast on very timely targets. Because once something's in a textbook, it's old news, right? So I think we need education to be on the cutting edge. And I'll just say on the capital side, if we have meaningful, high talent and high experience venture capital funds, that will attract so many founders. It'll attract so many attention. It'll accelerate the ecosystem overall. So we need to have these very credible internationalized venture funds with the international connections for the founders to grow. So.
Yeah, so I already mentioned the regulatory side of things. I think for the fintech specifically, the National Bank is already doing a good job in my view. The regulatory sandbox is supporting the startups, attracting them, giving them the space to develop, because you cannot apply the same standards to startups as the traditional, more mature companies. Education centers, I think we need to do more, and I think in terms of our fintech hub discussions that we've had, we want to also bring some of the international experience, and whether it's a fintech course. We are relying on our colleagues that have done this in other countries. One thing that I would say on people who are participating in the startup ecosystems, they're willing to share. They're willing to come to new countries. They're willing to teach. So I think we need to tap into that international resources. The most challenging right now, I see those two. I think we can manage is the venture capital. We need to get them in Georgia. I think it's starting a little bit. We see signs. We did not see any signs, 5 years ago. Now we're seeing some venture capital funds getting interested in Georgia. And that's a bit of maybe an uphill struggle right now, but we need to actually get them interested. And I would count on regional funds. So whether it's Turkish funds or London-based funds or Israeli funds, I think we would have better chance to attract them here, to open a presence and have presence here. Maybe GITA can also play a role in terms of co-participating with them and supporting them and encouraging them.
Well, let's hope that all the parties, media included, plays its role, and then somehow we put Georgia on the global map in terms of tech, not only fintech, but all the other technologies that are there. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was an honor to host you here at BMG. I'm certainly sure that we'll continue to talk about these and other topics in the future as well.
Yeah, I think we have some good stuff coming up, so really excited to share it with you when it's baked.
Of course, absolutely.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks.
The Checkpoint is presented by GM Pharma, the first international multinational pharmaceutical company in Georgia. GM Pharma, to serve those who need it most.